Greetings everyone, I'm very excited to be welcoming you to this guided tutorial on one of the most popular openings in chess, the Ruy Lopez. I hope this video is going to be very different from most other opening videos you can find online in the way that I'm going to be explaining the moves from the very first move. I don't expect you to have a perfect memory and memorize first 15 to 20 moves, but I'm going to give you all the tools and explain you the logic behind the main ideas, main plans in the Ruy Lopez opening, so that you could comfortably after this video go online and try it out. It's going to be very friendly for beginners and intermediate level players, and perhaps there are also more advanced players who are playing d4, 1c4 to start, and they would like to start playing 1e4. I think this is going to cover all the main ideas that are fundamental. So without further ado, let's start making the first moves. White is going to start the game with e4. Black is going to play e5, knight to f3, applying pressure on the pawn, knight to c6, and here a very logical move. It prepares to castle, and it also applies pressure on the knight that is defending e5. Now, first thing to note is that white is not threatening actually to win the pawn on e5. Now, the main move for black nowadays is still a6. However, there is another move which is becoming very popular, immediately playing the knight move to f6, and that's called the Berlin defense. It was popularized in 2000 when world champion Garry Kasparov lost the title to another Russian player called Vladimir Kramnik. And he popularized this defense for the black pieces, and in the modern age, it's one of the two main ways of handling this defense with black. Let's take a look at the move a6. Now, as I have mentioned, it's very important to know that in this position, if you do take on c6, black should be taking with the d pawn, and white is unable to win the pawn here on e5 because black can play queen to d4 and then win the pawn back with this beautiful double attack. However, there are many instances where in the middle game white is going to be guarding e4 pawn with, for example, the pawn or the rook, sometimes even with the queen, and then this threat of removing the knight and winning the pawn becomes available because the e4 pawn is guarded, therefore the black's queen wouldn't be executing that double attack. Now after a6, white has two ways of playing mainly. One is to go back, which is more popular, and the other one is to exchange the knight on c6. Now let's take a look what happens if we trade. So black, as we saw, is going to take back, and over here the main move nowadays is actually to castle. However, very often, castling and other moves that are available for white are going to lead to a pawn structure, which is what I want you to understand. And that pawn structure arises after white plays d4. In the old days, that was a more popular move. Nowadays, it's not as popular. But let's analyze that because I think it's more important to understand the ideas behind the middle game plans here rather than the concrete move orders. At least that's the purpose of this video. So black can capture on d4. We're going to take, and the queen exchange is happening. Now in this position, there are two ideas that you have to understand. First of all, white has a majority on the king side, and that's a healthy majority. None of the white's pawns are doubled. They have 4 against 3, and the main plan for white is going to be creating a pass pawn on the right side of the board. So you can imagine that white can go at some point f4, e5, f5, and with e6 at some point, black is allowing white to create a pass pawn, which we hope to promote as white and win the game. Of course, black is going to fight with all the means and try to stop us from creating that pass pawn on the right side, but that is the main plan that white has. However, black on the left side, even though they have majority, it's not healthy due to the double pawns on the c file. And so black is unable to create a pass pawn. The c pawns, you could imagine, for example, let's say in our imagination, we remove the yellow pawns, the b pawns. The c pawn of white, right now that I'm highlighting, is going to be able to stop 2 pawns of blacks. So black is unable to find counterplay on that left side of the board with their own pass pawn. So this even means that, for example, king and pawn endgame is winning for white. As a compensating factor, black has the so-called bishop pair. So 2 bishops are most of the time more powerful than bishop or knight or 2 knights combination. And so the position is considered to be balanced. White has this better pawn structure with a pass pawn opportunity, and black on the other hand has the bishop pair. And we have a very interesting battle between these elements. And it's important to note that for this reason, if white gets a chance to exchange one of the black's bishops, they want to do that for our knights or the bishop that we have. This way we can take away their advantage in the middle game. So I think that this is the most important idea to understand, and we can go back and analyze the move bishop to a4 over here, simply retreating. So in this position, I do not recommend for black playing b5. Usually the move b5 is going to be played later in the middle game in the Ruy Lopez, but now that black hasn't developed pieces, it's considered to be perhaps not very dubious move, but at least unpopular move. So sometimes it's sympathetic, as once the bishop retreats to b3, black is able to attack the bishop with knight to a5, and of course black is threatening to win the bishop pair. But because they're highly undeveloped, white can a lot of times simply castle, and if black decides to take on b3 and win the bishop pair, white can soon take over the center with move like d4. You could see that white already has castled, while black hasn't developed any of their pieces. And in these positions, white usually has quite a big advantage. That doesn't mean that it's not playable for black, and that doesn't mean I made all the perfect moves for black, but white has an advantage over here. By the way, notice how it's interesting that white's queen came out early in the game, because black doesn't have a way to hit the white's queen with a minor piece, so that would be winning a tempo, chasing the black's queen while developing a piece. White's queen on d4 is very active and well established because it's safe over here from at least the black's pieces. So as we go back, I thought that it's important to note this move b5, and the main move for black is simply playing knight to f6 over here. Now, what is interesting in a lot of e4, e5 openings that are characterized by these pawns, white can temporarily at least often sacrifice the e4 pawn. So the mechanism of how we would be winning that pawn back very often involves the move rook to e1. That is not the most popular move, but the idea is that we're pinning the knight and pawn to the king, and this allows us easily to win the pawn back. The most popular move is usually d4 in most of these lines. Although rook e1 is playable, white is energetically opening up the center, trying to open up the files so that white could punish the black's opening of the center, and in a situation where black is behind in development and black's king is still vulnerable in the center. So typically in this position, black now kicks away the white's bishops. They want to alleviate the pressure that exists by the white's bishop on c6. White's bishop has only one square. Then black is playing d5 to solidify the knight, and white can win the pawn back on e5. And this would be the main line of the Ruy Lopez variation that is called the open Ruy Lopez. So when they take the pawn, the position slightly bit opens, and it is considered to be opened. And from here on, one of the moves that white can play is c3, and the most natural moves for white would be following this up with moves like knight to d4, perhaps developing the knight to d2, placing the bishop on c2 to apply pressure on the knight. Very often also a4 is involved to put pressure on b5. So this would be the so-called open Ruy Lopez. If you don't want to learn these more forcing lines after your opponents take the pawn over here, you could also just be playing rook to e1, and I'm sure you're going to win the pawn back with solid position for white. Most of the time, black does not take the pawn, and they play bishop to e7, and that's considered to be closed Ruy Lopez because the position remains closed. And right now, because rook e1 would no longer be pinning the knight and pawn to the king, there are too many pieces in between. At this time, white already defends the pawn and doesn't allow black to capture that. So in this position that we're guarding finally the pawn on e4, white is threatening to remove the guard and win the pawn on e5. So for example, if we waste a move for black, let's say they play a move like h6, we can now take on c6 the knight. They take back, and finally we can take on e5. Remember that queen d4 is no longer forcing the loss of a pawn for white, because white can go back knight to f3 and hit the queen. Now queen is unable to take here because rook is protecting that, and with the next move we can defend the pawn with d3 after black's queen runs away, and we secure our pawn up advantage over here. So because after rook e1, white is already threatening that tactic to remove the guard and take on e5, black plays b5 to kick away the bishop. Now after bishop b3, black would want to execute the idea of knight to a5. Once knight a5 is played, white's bishop doesn't have a square to go to, and that would mean that black would win not only a very powerful bishop of white's, but also win the so-called bishop pair. But they're unable to do that here because the e5 pawn is hanging. So white would win the pawn, and obviously the bishop pair is not worth being a pawn down. So the next move for black is also very logical. They're playing the move d6, and if black had a move, very likely they would want to play knight to a5 in order to, well, win the white's bishop or exchange it for the knight. That's what I mean to say when I say exchange or win the white's bishop. Now, for this reason, because black is threatening knight to a5, now a very logical move for white is pawn to c3. So that if black plays knight to a5, our bishop would be able to go to c2. A lot of the time students ask, why not a3? Because that would also secure the bishop. Now we have a2 square. Well, c3 is a little bit more flexible because it would also help us to achieve later one of our main plans. So the break pawn to d4 that is highlighted right now in yellow. And in this position, very often black castles. And now white starts some series of prophylactic moves, which are very popular in the Ruy Lopez. And typically we start with h3. The idea behind this move is usually to prevent the spin. If black's bishop comes to g4, they'll be pinning the knight, which is going to be supporting the pawn break d2 to d4. And from here on, this is where theory just starts for advanced players. Black and white has many ways to play. Some ideas that are important to know is that the way we punish black, they have equalized in space. They're playing audaciously. They're not giving us typical space advantage that white gets in many other openings, but we're trying to expose their b5 and e5 pawns. So often our main go-to ideas are going to be involving pawn breaks d4 with pressure application on e5, or even pushing later further to d5, especially if the black's pawn is going to be on c5. Now, we not as often like to put the pawn on d5 when the pawn is on c7 square, because then black is able to play c6 and apply a lot of pressure on the square d5 or our pawn on d5. Another typical idea that white uses is also a4. We sometimes like to open up the a file and create play there, as well as apply pressure on this pawn on b5. So a4 and d4 are main go-to ideas. White's knight very often goes to d2, and from here it has a lot of sympathetic squares. When it moves to the f1 square, we could go to g3 square, we could go to e3 square, and you could see that there are many opportunities awaiting for us from those squares. And black has also quite a few ways to place this. Perhaps bishop to b7 will be a natural developing move, and that's one of the moves that is considered to be the main line over here. Black this way would be applying pressure in the future against your e4 pawn. A lot of times black also plays knight a5, winning the tempo on the bishop, and then involving the move c5 to fight for space. And sometimes they even play knight b8 and knight to d7, a little bit maneuvering the knight, re-coordinating the pieces, again to help black get this c5 break. Now, as we go back, I just briefly would like to look at the Berlin defense. I don't want you to go away without this line. And here it's important to know that white has two very different ways of playing. So one would be going for what's called the famous Berlin endgame, and the other one would be the anti-Berlin move, d3, simply protecting the pawn. So I'm just going to show you the famous Berlin endgame and the moves that lead to that. White castles, black takes the pawn on e4, and now white again has the move rook e1 that we have discussed earlier, but white could also play the move d4, trying to open up the position when black is behind in development, when black's king is still in the center. And now you may understand the reason why black did involve the move a6, so that in this position precisely, when the black's knight moves to d6, it would hit the bishop. Because if the white's bishop was on a4, then black's knight wouldn't be able to go there with the so-called tempo. So in this position, white typically exchanges on c6. because now they can take on e5 and put pressure on the knight, and as the knight moves, white is able to take and exchange the queens when it ruins the black's castling right. So black goes to f5, and we take on d8, and king takes. And before the year 2000, people thought that this is not a good endgame for black. Obviously, black lost the right to castle, and at the time computers were showing this as a very bad score for black. Computer was saying white is much better. But then Kramnik incorporated that in the match against Kasparov, and Kasparov, out of 6 white games that he had, all games led to draw, and he never could beat Kramnik in this endgame. And you could recognize perhaps the main ideas over here by looking at the structure. It resembles a little bit the exchange variation of the Ruy Lopez. White has 4 against 3 healthy majority on the right side, and so the main plan of white is still to be creating a pass pawn there eventually. And the compensating factor for black is going to be the bishop pair. So white would love to exchange one of the black's bishops, especially the light square bishop, which white no longer has. So these are the main go-to ideas that I would like to teach you today in the Ruy Lopez. Let me know in the comments if you liked the video with the video camera, and if you would like me to continue this video series where I cover the main ideas behind the most popular openings. You could also consider hiring me as your personal online chess coach. Thank you for watching the video, and I will see you in the next lesson.